should have your machine fully threaded now and you should be ready to sew. So we're going to take a deep breath, it's not going to be scary. We're going to go through some basic stitches and we're going to show you how to use the machine. So in the next couple of lessons, we'll show you how to reverse, how to sew a straight stitch, how to change your stitches, how to change direction, and how to do it all confidently. So before we start, let's just do a double check and make sure that we've got 2 threads and that they're both pulled to the back of the machine. We need about 6 to 8 inches of thread loose before you start sewing. And the reason for this is if it's too short, as your machine starts working through the stitch, it can pull the end of the thread through the needle eye, so you will lose your thread. So it's always best to have a slightly longer piece of thread to start with, and then that won't happen to you. So I'm going to take you through some basics. I've got a piece of fabric here, and I'm going to show you how to put it under the presser foot. So I'm just going to start by doing a little line of stitches for you. So I'm going to put the fabric underneath and I'm going to drop my presser foot down. And what that means is the presser foot now has the fabric clamped to the machine. So the fabric is being held very securely, as you can see. I can't pull that out from underneath the presser foot. So we always need to have our presser foot down before we start sewing. The other thing we're going to talk about is our foot pedal. So the foot pedal is just like in your car. It controls the speed of the needle and how fast the machine is stitching. So get that into position on the floor underneath your foot, and it should be just as it is in the car, with the wedge part, the thicker part, near your toes, so that you can press down on it to get the speed right. Now, speed is something that takes a little bit of practice. Some people can't help but put foot to the floor and off they go as fast as they can. Now, that's fine if you can control that, but it's always best to try and vary your speed and just try and control it so that you're in control of the sewing machine and it's not getting away from you. So we're going to start with a straight stitch, and most of your stitching to begin with as a beginner will be with a straight stitch, which means that all of the other scary ones on your machine you can ignore for now, just while you're concentrating on getting your skills. So this one has started, you can see, with 00. So this electronic machine, that's the automatic selection. It's giving me a width measurement here and it's giving me a length. The width is the zigzag going up and down, and the length is just, you can see the dashes getting longer. So that's the way I remember which one is which. The 00 down here corresponds with a straight stitch, and you can see that this stitch is a middle needle position, and the way I can tell that is there's a little oval lozenge shape on the bottom of the stitch, and the stitch is coming down through the middle of that position. The one next to it, you can see, is in the left hand position. So you can see that the stitch is to the left instead of being in the middle. Now, as a beginner, I would stay in the middle needle position just while you're practicing. But your machine won't explode if you put it onto any of these other stitches. So as you get confident, feel free to try out some other ones. Right, so onto the straight stitch. I'm not going to change anything here, I'm just going to leave it exactly as it is. And I'm not going to worry about where my fabric is positioned, I just want to get you started stitching. So, I'm going to check I've got my presser foot lowered, so my fabric is underneath. I'm going to get my foot pedal in position, and I'm just going to slowly, before I start, drop down my needle into the fabric. Now that helps to grab everything, and it also helps to stop your threads from coming out at the back, and it's a good habit to get into before you start any row of stitching. So my needle is in position, and I'm just going to start by putting my foot down on the foot pedal, and off we go. So you can see, I'm trying to do it slowly so you can see the needle going up and down, creating those stitches behind me. I can put my foot down slightly faster or harder. The machine is going to go slightly faster, and and then the speed's going up again, and then I can drop it back down again, and I'm just going to come straight off the edge of the fabric. There we are. So I've cleared the edge of the fabric. I'm going to lift my presser foot again, and I'm going to pull the whole thing away, and you can see I've still got my 2 threads attached. Now some machines will have a little cutter on the side which you can use, or you can just use a little pair of scissors to cut your threads. And at this stage we want to just look at our stitches and make sure that our machine has been threaded properly. So we should have stitches very clear on one side, and we should have stitches clearly formed on the other side. If something has gone wrong and there's loops instead of stitches, just rethread your machine again, go back to that lesson and try again. It may just be that something has come out or you haven't done something properly. Okay, so we're going to do that again, but this time we're going to measure how far in our stitches are from the edge. And this is called a seam allowance. And it means that when you're creating an item or a garment, that it's being created to the right size it should be, because you're not just stitching randomly towards the edge of the fabric. So quite often we like to use the edge of our presser foot here, so this edge here. And this is 1/4 of an inch from the needle to the edge of the foot. And it's quite nice, you can see if I line the foot up, you can see that you have a nice clear run down the edge of the fabric that can keep you in a nice straight line. You also have other measurements on here. So there's 1/2 inch, there's 5/8 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch, all the way up to 1 3/4 inches on this machine. You can choose any measurement you like just for this practice, but when you're looking at a pattern, you should always check what the seam allowance is, and then you line the edge of the fabric up on that line. So this is 5/8. I would line the fabric up on the 5/8 line, and I would follow that line along the edge of the fabric, making sure that I'm keeping it straight. So if you usually work in metric, the metric measurements will be on your base plate as well on most modern machines. I am going to sew at 5/8, so I'm going to line my fabric up along the 5/8 line here. I'm going to start at the very edge of the fabric, because you should always be starting at the edge of the fabric when you start, because you don't want a little gap at the very start or at the finish of your stitches. I'm going to come all the way down just using this edge as a seam allowance on that 5/8 line. I'm going to drop my needle down again, just like before, and then we're going to come all the way down. Now the machine will sew straight, but you need to be aware of your seam allowance, trying to keep it straight all the way down. And then we're going to stop right at the edge of the fabric. I'm going to lift my presser foot. You may need to lift your needle. Your needle may have stopped in the bottom position. And we'll pull it away again, just break our threads. And there we've got a 5/8 seam allowance with a line of straight stitches. Okay, so I'm back again with a new piece of fabric, and I'm going to show you this time about the reverse button. So this button here with this U with an arrow on it, you may have a big lever on the other side of your machine. Just refer to your manual and find where your reverse button is. And the reverse button is really important because it locks your stitches. It's instead of tying a knot when you start and you finish. And it just makes it so much quicker and makes all of your garments and items that you sew much stronger. You don't want to leave those stitches loose because your seams would just come away at the minute of any pressure. So we're going to start by doing a couple of stitches. So we will do 2 or 3 stitches, and then we will press the reverse button while having our foot down on the foot pedal. And this will take the needle back those same 2 or 3 stitches. Now I'm going to put my speed down just so that you can clearly see what I'm doing. So I'm going to do 2 or 3 stitches. I'll start with my needle down, just like before. And then we'll come forward a couple of stitches. And then I'm going to press my reverse button and put my foot down. And you can see my thread and needle and fabric are going backwards. So it's just gone over the same line of stitches, and then I'm going to put the foot down again. So actually you've got 3 layers of stitches there at the beginning and at the end. So I'm going to come down, let me put my speed up, come down to the other end. And then as I reach the end of the fabric, I'm preparing myself, so I'm just going to press my reverse, and then I can come off the edge of the fabric. There we are. So you can see you get these slightly heavier layers of stitches at the beginning and at the end, but they're sat on top of each other and you can hardly notice them, but it does make your seams nice and strong. The next thing we're going to talk about is changing direction. So lovely straight lines are perfect, but sometimes you need to turn corners, and we're just going to show you how to do that. So I'm going to sew a square on my little test piece of fabric here. I'm going to start and come all the way around and change in direction a couple of times. So start as I did before, pop my needle down, and I'm going to come forward a couple of inches, and then I'm going to stop. So I've stopped there, and you can see that my needle is up out of the fabric. Yours may have stopped down in the fabric, and that's fine. We want it down in the fabric. If yours is up like mine, just move your needle down towards you until it is down in the fabric. And what that means is I can then lift my presser foot and I can move that fabric anywhere that I want to, swizzling it round on the needle, because the needle is holding it in place. If I had lifted it while the needle was up, it just would have been completely loose and we would have lost the stitches. So now that I've lifted it and changed direction, I'm going to pop my presser foot back down again, and I'm going to start sewing. Something to remember is that the fabric under the machine will always move away from you, and that's something that beginners very often get confused about. They don't know what way the machine is going to move the fabric, but it's always away from you towards the back of the machine. So I'm going to stop again, drop my needle back down, lift my foot, change direction, and then I'm moving away again. There we are. Let's see if I can get an accurate square. Do I get extra points if I do? There we go. Drop my needle back down, lift, turn it around, and then back down. There we are. And I'm going to stop with a little reverse, so you can see as you're stopping, and when you start and stop, you should always start and stop with a reverse stitch. There we are, and my needle's up. I'll lift my foot, pull it away, break my threads, and there we have it. That's how to change direction. So next, what we want to do is we're going to do a basting stitch. So very often patterns will ask you to do a basting stitch instead of pinning your item together. And this is just a temporary stitch, which is usually a very long stitch. It will be the longest stitch that you can create on your machine. It's still a straight stitch, so I'm still going to be on my 00, which is my standard straight stitch. But what I am going to do is I'm going to change this length here to the longest it can go. And the way I do that on this machine is I move the dial across until I'm on the length stitch here. Yours may be that you have a choice of 2 or 3 straight stitches, and you should just choose the longest one on your dial. So once I'm on this, I'm just going to use the arrows to go all the way up to 5. That's as far as it will go. So we're just going to sew a straight line of basting stitches across here. I'm starting at the edge of my fabric just as before, with my tails long, and I'm going to drop my needle down just like before. We're just going to come straight to the other end. So I'm not doing a reverse when I start and when I stop on this basting stitch, because the point of the basting stitch very often is that you put them in as temporary stitches. and at some point you will need to take them back out again, so we'll show you how to do that as well. So just continue and do a straight line of basting stitches from one end to the other. Okay, and when we get to this end, we're going to pull this away, and I'm going to leave my tails nice and long so you can see what I'm going to do next. So you can see we've got much longer stitches here on both sides of the fabric. And the idea is that you can just hook a pair of scissors or a pin underneath one of the stitches, and you can just give it a pull and the whole thing will come out. Oops, I've broken the thread, but they will come out really nice and easily, and then everything will come off on the other side as well. So if that was holding something together temporarily, you can easily take them out afterwards. So that's the basting stitch. So the final stitch we want to show you is a zigzag stitch. And a zigzag stitch is a great one for beginners to learn because you can use it on the inside seams of some of your fabrics and some of your makes. Specifically if you have fabric that frays quite a lot, so if the threads are coming away on the inside of the fabric, so you can use the zigzag stitch to cut down on the amount of fraying on the inside of your projects. It's also a nice decorative stitch, and it's quite nice to do a zigzag stitch instead of a straight stitch sometimes. So it gives you a little option to do something different. So here you'll see my zigzag stitch is number 7. So I'm just going to put my cursor back across here, and I'm going to change my stitch selection to 7. And you can see this is giving me quite a wide stitch at 5 and 1.5 length. So let's see what that looks like. So I'm just going to stitch it on the fabric for now, just to show you what it looks like. And you will see the needle will do something unusual. It's already starting slightly over to the left, but the zigzag stitch moves left and right across the fabric. So it's moving in that gap in your presser foot, back and forth, creating those zigzags. You will also see that the hole in the middle of the presser foot, the needle is going either side of it, and that's a really good guide for when you want to use it on the edge of your fabric. So I'll show you that now. Let me just cut it. I'll show you my zigzag stitches. They look very nice. So if you're using it on the edge of your fabric to seal the edges and stop the frays, what we want to do is we want to line the edge of the fabric with the little split in the middle, or the middle position on your presser foot. So when we do that, you will see what will happen. There we go. So you can see that the zigzag is going on and off the edge of the fabric, and it's enclosing the edge of the fabric and just keeping it under control. And that's really useful for the inside of your projects, just to make them nice and neat and tidy. There we are. So we'll pull that off. Oops. There we are. So you can see the zigzag has gone across the edge of the fabric. It's holding the edge of the fabric in place, so it's cutting down on those frays. So if we're using the zigzag stitch, you can play around with the different measurements here. So we can change the width and we can change the length. So let me change the length. We'll leave the width at 5, and we're just going to move the length up to, say, a 3. And we'll just stitch next to the one that we did previously, and you'll be able to see what the difference is. And this is a great thing to do to get to know your machine, just on a piece of scrap fabric that you can have a little bit of a play around with, and you can even write on the fabric to say this one was a 3 length and a 5 width, and then you can have a little guide to see what your different stitches look like. So you can see that it's still as wide, but the stitches are longer apart. Now if I was to move, let's move the other one back, let's move the other one down. So we'll put that down to a 1.5 and a 3 length, and let's see what happens. You can see my zigzag is much shallower now. It's not as deep as it was. And obviously these, if you're using it as a decorative stitch, these all have different properties. So you might like one of them for one project and one for another. So there you go, that's the basics of sewing. We've covered how to move your presser foot up and down, controlling your speed with your foot pedal. We've talked about the different stitches, we've talked about seam allowance, and all of those things aren't as scary as you thought they were in the first place. One thing we would say is really beneficial for beginners is to practice. So give yourself an hour, make yourself a nice cup of tea and get a little bit of scrap fabric, maybe an old duvet cover or a pillowcase or an old t-shirt you're not using, and just practice the stitches. Practice changing your length, changing your width, changing it to a different stitch, and also practice your speed control and moving the fabric around, doing your reversing, changing direction. Also practice threading your machine, and that will become a muscle memory, something that you will do automatically without thinking about it. And every time you do that, coming to the machine the next time will be so much easier. So have a little practice, have a little play, and then we'll come back and show you some more basics about your machine.